Hello.
Hello. Hi, Evelyn. How are you?
I'm well, Carrie. How are you doing today?
I'm well, thank you.
And welcome to anyone who's watching our January webinar, Alpha Male Leaders Talk About Women in Power. And
especially this month, your topic, Evelyn, about the question around well-behaved women rarely make history, the quote from Laurel, I forget her middle name, Ulrich,
yes.
in the book you wrote.
Yes. Yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about that. I got her book. I'm not finished it, but it's interesting to hear her perspective on where that phrase came from and how it's evolved over time. I also wanted to mention that we don't have a special guest this month, and we decided we wanted to talk a little bit more about our interests in alpha male leadership, what that means to us, and our interest in women in power and what that means. We are going to carry on bringing on guests on our monthly webinars, but to start off the year, we thought we'd do it a little differently. Mm-hmm. So, shall I read that little piece that I was referring to?
Yeah, well, maybe perhaps even how you came. I've heard the quote many times before, but you had brought it forward, and I think it'd be interesting to talk about, to set the context about that quote and what brought that forward. And yes. Then what you've got from the book, the context would be great.
Yeah. It popped up in a social feed that I'm checking out regularly. And it occurred to me that the phrase, there's two versions of it. The one that she coined was well-behaved women seldom make history. And, she does note in her book that there's virtually no difference. But so it became well-behaved women rarely make history. Mm-hmm. But when she was using that phrase, she's an historian, and when she was coined that phrase initially, she was doing research on women historically of different generations. And it sort of fell out quite readily. She didn't realize she was making an earth-shaking quote at the time. And I guess what she was really saying was not that we should be badly behaved, but that women's place in history is a small one. And we're often as not remembered for being badly behaved. Not that we should be badly behaved, but that's often one of the things, for instance, that carves out a place for us. And for instance, Joan of Arc, well, my brain isn't sharp enough this morning to list off a bunch of names, but I'm sure you've all got one in your mind that springs up. So what she was referring to, though, was the restrictions that are placed on us historically and societally to be well behaved, to conform, and to occupy a specific place in history, especially in the place where history is written by men. Mm-hmm. So I think what she was talking about in her book, in the preface, was what that meant to her at the time, how it's become changed, and how over the years it's being taken over by women of all generations to mean various things, including that you have to misbehave to make history.
Go ahead.
Let's see.
Well, while you're looking for that, Evelyn, it's interesting. I had not gone back to the original research, but when I heard that quote many years ago, to me, I always placed it in the context of how expectations over time, and certainly when I was young and when my mother was young, the expectations about being a good girl, behave like a good girl, be a nice girl, all the societal mores on what it means to be a young woman, a girl, were all about being well behaved. And that clearly, in my learning about women in history, there were very precious few. I mean, if we look back, and like Laurel is an American, if we look into our Canadian history, the people that come to mind are the famous five who got us the vote in 1929, like Nellie McClung. I used to have a poster up in my office back in Toronto that I'll just have to call it back. It was never explain, never retreat. Just get the thing done and let them howl. And that, to me, that quote, I believe it was Nellie McClung, it was one of the five. That quote to me is very, speaks to what Laurel's quote was saying, that if you try to behave, if you are well behaved, the chances of you making history as a woman were slim to none. The women who are in history aren't the ones who behaved according to the norms. They stepped out. They went well beyond lean in. But in their day, whatever context that was, it required more than leaning in. It required stepping out way beyond what was expected to get noticed. And after Saturday, after the Women's March here in Vancouver, that was replicating the Vancouver March on, the Women's March on Washington and globally, I'd say that we all are in a place where that's what's next for us, is what are we doing that's stepping out of that mold? Because I think that mold still constricts and shapes what is expected of women, what behavior is expected of women.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and the notion that men are making history and they're making the decisions, and women ought to be companions and, as you said, stay in that well-behaved place. I'll just read you this quote. When I wrote that well-behaved women seldom make history, I was making a commitment to help recover the lives of otherwise obscure women. I had no idea that 30 years later, my own words would come back to me transformed. While I, like some of the use of the slogan more than others, I wouldn't call it back even if I could. I applaud the fact that so many people, students, teachers, quilters, nurses, newspaper columnists, old ladies in nursing homes, and mayors of Western towns think they have the right to make history. So in this book, she's talking specifically about three women and their intersection with creating history. But she also refers to the well-behaved women that had the courage to, as you say, step out, like Rosa Parks. Mm-hmm. Rosa Parks quietly changed history by refusing to sit in the back of the bus. She didn't go out and yell and scream. She didn't misbehave, other than she had the courage to step outside the restrictions that were put on her by a racist apartheid society.
Well, and what's interesting is I think at the time, too, she was not seen as well-behaved because she did thwart what was expected of a well-behaved Black woman on a bus. And this whole entire notion of what it means to behave.
Yes.
Austin Powers comes to mind. Oh, behave, right? Because we're often taught to behave. I mean, and I know young boys are as well, but there's an interesting way in which men who behave badly are treated very differently from women who behave outside of any norm, you know? So it's, we only have to look at what's going on right now to see how that can be celebrated. That poor behavior, bad behavior, whatever you want to call it, can be celebrated. It's not very often that it's celebrated if it's a woman who's doing it. And there's lots of opportunities to look at it from all genders. Of what that means, but certainly, when I look at Laurel, what you're describing about Laurel Ulrich's research, even just looking at what it meant for the women who were so-called behaved and how they helped to shape history. They just didn't get a voice in it. We don't see a lot of even today. We don't see a lot of women's voices in creating history. Even in my own field of negotiation, for example, most of the books, the tomes, the larger books that are out there are written by men. There are a few that are written by women, and it takes a long time for them to get the traction into the quote mainstream of that field, even though they are high level academics and or business people. They don't get the same play. They don't get the same visibility.
Yeah. I was speaking this morning with my colleague from France. She was in Paris working this week. She's a coach, but she lives in Lyon. And so last weekend on Saturday, she was among the marchers in Lyon. And she said it was fascinating to see women misbehaving. She didn't use that word, but culturally things are a little bit different everywhere, but from her perspective, to see women out there shaking their arms and yelling at the top of their lungs was shocking from a French perspective. And she said, it's interesting that women do not have a place to raise their arms and yell at the top of their lungs, where men do at sports events all the time. That's acceptable behavior. Or if you see men in a march, that's acceptable behavior. But she said it was shocking to see women behaving with that much freedom of expression on Saturday.
Well, and it's interesting. You and I were talking before we got on air here about my experience at the march here in Vancouver, and from everything that I've seen about all the global marches around the world, it's fantastic that. And it's interesting because we're talking about what it means to be well behaved, what it means to misbehave. Globally, I have not seen any record of there being any police arrests. Everything seemed to be a peaceable march everywhere, including the massive march in Washington and the 400,000 that showed up in New York City. I think there were reports were 15 to 20,000 here in Vancouver, which doesn't sound like a ginormous number, but for Vancouver, we're actually a much smaller city than we might give the world to believe. That's a great number. And the fact is, when we were walking on the march, we'd actually walked after the rally at the front end for an hour and a half, and we'd actually walked 4 blocks and had just made the second to last turn before reaching the Trump Tower, which was the destination for our march. And my husband was with me on the march, as many men were, which was fantastic, men and children, and everyone having a good time, great posters, overwhelmingly positive. Yes, there were some negative messages, but overwhelmingly the messages were positive, and they were about rights for all, and really supporting women's rights, gay rights, immigrant rights, all rights, and we had ducked in to use a washroom, and when we came out, we finally saw the police presence. It wasn't until that moment that there was even a police presence helping to ensure that the traffic was stopping to allow all of the marchers to make that particular turn. Other than that, I didn't even see any other presence at all, which was a real contrast actually to back into November when we had Remembrance Day, November 11th. We were down at Victory Square, and we actually saw the tanks that were on the streets that were parked this way to prevent a large truck from coming through and plowing down pedestrians. So the actual police and military presence was quite high that day. It wasn't anywhere to be seen. If it was around, it was very invisible. And, I saw other tweets from, I think it was from the San Diego police that actually tweeted, I don't know, it was in Oregon. They'd actually tweeted out to thank the marchers. It was the most peaceful march they'd seen, and they were thanking the marchers for, in a way, being well behaved as marchers. So it's an interesting juxtaposition that I think the entire march itself was about women not doing what might be expected of them and saying, this is important. We need to show up, and those others who showed up of all genders who showed up to support. It was all about that. It was about saying this behavior that we're seeing out there that we are not in favor of, we don't want to see in our world, and for Canadians in our country. We're stepping outside our quiet side and saying no, doing it in a respectful, very peaceful way, and it goes back to, I think, what you were saying about Laurel's research is there are lots of evidence of women and lots of people who make history without necessarily being loud and shouting and being aggressive. There are lots of ways to do that, and there's. Anyway, those are all my thoughts from the march, and it was just an interesting juxtaposition. Yes, there was a feeling of freedom to be all together and walking, and I think that freedom that your colleague in France was speaking about was actually a freedom to walk together, a freedom of speech, a freedom of association. There were a number of unions that were present to support as well. And so yeah, it was a really fascinating day, and there's never been anything like it in history. And from a woman's gathering perspective, I mean, look at the countries that were showing up on the feeds.
Yeah,
it's fantastic.
Yeah, it was amazing. The other thing that I was noticing this morning, and I mentioned earlier when we were talking, Gloria Feldt's newsletter this morning, in which she talked about, let me just pull that up. When she does workshops, she does about women in power. She asks the women in the room on a scale of 1 to 10, where they would position themselves in terms of their feelings about their personal power. And she said it's very rare to see anybody put their hand up as a 10. But she said after the march on Saturday, she was doing a workshop. I'm not sure if it was the next day or if it was this Monday. When she asked the question, almost every participant declared herself a 10. So, and she says, I realize there's self-selection in terms of who's coming to this workshop, but she still said, you know, the difference was tremendous. So sorry?
Oh, I was just going to say, I'd be curious to ask a supplemental question. How many of them were on the march, and where they would have placed themselves before that? Like, I'm curious about how being on that march can really help to empower that. You know, it's about being part of a group without the mob mentality, but feeling like you're not doing it alone. I think that's the hardest thing.
Yes.
Standing on.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think you're hit on something that is important. There's the distinction between feeling supported and feeling part of a mob, or feeling part of a group as opposed to feeling part of a mob. And I think that Saturday was huge for creating that awareness for women around the world. Another interesting part of the discussion. There's a couple of things coming up. One of which I see some women saying, I don't need a march, I don't need feminism. And a lot of conversations about, back again to the idea of feminism, which for many people has been a dirty word for many years. So seeing young people put in context the history of a women's movement that has taken us in a very short period of time, in really barely 100 years, to being chattels legally, to becoming citizens of our society. And so it's heartening for me as a woman who was, a feminist in the 60s and 70s, to see that recollection, to see that history having a context and a continuum, a sense of a continuum. Because up until this weekend, I would have said I've seen a lot of women who think that they've won equal rights because they think that they're equally represented in society, that they have choices, that, certainly they think they're exercising choices in all manner of ways, which is true. But that the barriers are not as visible as they used to be, but they're still there.
Well, I'm sorry. I'm pausing because I'm having an echo on my end.
Yeah, I can hear it. That's better.
Where does it come from? I haven't done anything. In any event, I think what the most recent events, Friday's inauguration, have shown is how fragile it is.
Uh-huh.
I was talking with a group on Monday night, other women lawyers I know, and we were talking about, we were watching a live cast from UCLA Law School, a woman whose name I don't recall, but she was talking about LGBTQ families. She's a lawyer who works in that area, and how difficult things are for them to in that area to create agreements to get care, to adopt children, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it's hard. It's hard enough in the non-LGBT, in the heterosexual world. Let's put it more simply, to do many of those things, but to complicate it. But yeah, we were just talking about how. Have you ever seen a place in history where a group has won rights, and so many so quickly in the last 10 years, only to have them potentially taken away within the next year or so? Over the weekend, we watched Trump and a group of, there's a photograph that's circulating around the net of the group of white and white-haired, AKA older white men, all standing behind Trump, signing the bill on abortion rights.
Yep.
You know, this is these rights, these issues are fragile.
Yes.
I think a lot of young women are realizing that.
Yeah.
I saw a very eloquently written post, I think it was on Inc.com yesterday, about the notion of, I don't need to march, I don't need to have these excuses, I don't need feminism, and it was a young woman who wrote it, and she said, well, she said, she just started off saying thank you. She said, I want to thank you to every woman who stood there, every woman who marched. Thank you to every woman who's come before and who has created the world that I live in now. Yeah. Thank you for all that hard work. And just saying back to that response, that if you can't see that's the work that's been done and being done, then you really can't see what's around you. I've heard in another phrase you might call willful blindness, to be willfully blind to the situation that surrounds us, the context. You know, there's anyhow, that's a an interesting place to be in.
The other thing that's come up is a lot of discussion about what's next, and this is not just for women, but it's for it's for citizens of the U.S. especially.
And Canada. I think we cannot, it's not that we are not the 51st state, but we've seen some of the spillover already in the Alberta legislature, almost right after, some what we might call poor behavior showed up. It started to show up in the Alberta legislature. We're seeing it happening. The copycat thing that's happening in the run up to the
leadership
of the Conservative Party. Our rights are fragile too.
Yeah, they are. So what do you think about, for women and power, what do you think is next?
Well, I think it's interesting. I was listening to a podcast this morning with Elizabeth Cronise-McLaughlin, and she runs the Gaia Leadership Project for Women. And she was talking about a quote that she had. This was a podcast from earlier this year. And it was a quote that she saw on a parent of her son, a friend of her son's arm, I think it was arm, that was in French. And it was, on a été invincible, the summer, the invincible summer, which is part of a quote from Albert Camus, that in the darkest winter, I can find my invincible summer. And how the parallel with where we are now. And so I really was struck by that quote, and I was grateful for her for sharing that. First of all, because I loved Albert Camus, I like his writings, and also I think it was a really great one to see that the worst that we could imagine could be going on around us, and it's up to us to dig deep and to find that invincible summer within, that allows us to take the courage to grab what I like the phrase about grabbing a bag full of courage, and standing up for what matters. Like it's about finding out what matters to you, what's important, and not being silent anymore. And I think that not being silent is also about finding others, being with others. This I've talked before about the tall poppy, and the tall poppies. We don't want to have our heads chopped off. So the best way to not be a tall poppy whose head is chopped off is to be in a field of other tall poppies, because then you're not the lone one standing out with your neck stuck out. Sometimes we do need to be alone in that place and be willing to be alone, and knowing that we have others around us that are similarly supportive, and we have other voices that we, even just to be able to practice and rehearse how to confront, how to say the thing that needs to be said.
Yeah.
You know, doing that in partnership or as a group, making our voices known. I mean, there's so many things we can do.
Yeah.
I think of the alpha mares.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. The question.
They've been sometimes, and then they've had enough, right? Then they've had enough. And
well, what's interesting again about the symbol. The symbol, or the actuality, not the symbol, but the actuality of the alpha mare is she's the mare who is, she's typically off on her own. She's not in with the guys or the girls, and she's not sparring and playing and competing for position. So the alpha mare is the one that everybody just knows she has. You know, she's got what it takes, and she's not in charge of everything in life, but she's the one that you go to when things get tough. And I love the notion of, which goes back to the idea of your and my common love for horses and what we can learn from them, is that the alpha mare is the one who just kind of wears the power. It's not an external thing, but it's almost like she wears this cloak. It's a regal thing, and it tells everybody who she is. And there's this old idea that's not that old, but that in the world of horses, and I think it matches to the world of people, that there are three types. There are the leaders, the dominants, or the ones who are competing, and the followers. Mm-hmm. So it kind of divides the world into those three, and that it's the 80-20 rule as well. A small number of leaders, a small number of followers, and in the middle is that mass of people who are competing for position. May not be the top position, it may be the 3rd, 4th, 5th, or 10th spot in terms of a hierarchy, but there's a competition going on. So the alphas put themselves outside of that competition, and they've achieved their position. They have no longer a need to compete. And I find that a wonderful model for myself in terms of how I wish to be in society. I don't like competition, never have, but I'm not uncompetitive. So I do have the drive to compete. So I use that model myself, because competition can be rude, it can be misbehaved, it can be ugly, it can be brutal, and it can even become violent. And none of those things do I aspire to. So for me, power is more about influence. It's invisible. It's relationship. And those are areas that, certainly challenged me at times in my career. And I think we all struggle with at different times. We're not always getting along well with everyone, and we're not necessarily influencing people the way we want to. But those are all skills that we can, in fact, develop. Your thoughts?
Absolutely. I think somehow it picks up an echo. There we go. I think I need to say a few words and then it seems to go away. I don't know what that means. Well, it's interesting because I think competition can be harmful when it can be harmful, and there's also healthy competition, because I think sometimes competition can help because it can encourage us to do more.
Yes.
I think that kind of healthy competition we see, like when we had our Krista Golian on last time. I mean, she's certainly her career has been in a place of healthy competition.
Absolutely.
How we strive for excellence through that. and it can break relationships. It can break people apart when it gets to that aggressive place. I certainly see how it's harmful in negotiation as well, where if we end up with that unhealthy part of it, we don't get the best outcomes. We get the best outcomes from negotiations when we're in that collaborative place where creativity, creative solutions can come to bear. And sometimes we do still need to distribute some of those resources. So there's that place about how you do that. In any event, I think power is. I like the power really does live in influence. Whatever. If you're not talking about physical power, and even there, you're still. It's how you're using it. I like the distinction about that. Power comes in so many forms. The old form of power over is an old form. And there's this delightful way of thinking about power with others, and the power to do something. I mean, that's both of those are influence. The influence of relationships in the power with, and the relationship of power to that can still be in relationship, right? The idea of not trying to do it all yourself, but the power of a team, the power of a group to do something. I mean, Saturday being an enormous example of the power of a small group of people, the people who globally created the opportunity for the march, and everyone I looked at seemed to have a very similar framework to help shape the intention of the march into an overwhelmingly positive intention, as opposed to this was, even though the media there was one article I read in the local media, I think it was, and it was the actual article talked about the march being about marching to do this, and yet the headline still said anti-Trump march, and not one word in the article it said was anti-anything. It was all about pro-something, about being proactive. So we can still see how, there's an intent to overlay this negativity. Anyway, so I was going back to how this small group of people create opportunity in a very short space of time. Simply think by looking at what's our intention. What is it we're trying to create? What is it we want to have happen? And then being able to do that and set the framework really helps shape all those marches, I think.
Yeah.
I really believe that. And that's power. That's power, the power of intention.
It is.
The power of clarity.
Yeah.
And a shared vision.
Yeah, exactly. And I think I know what you say about everybody referring to these as anti-Trump marches, but I think it's true that we do come together as a reaction to something, and certainly we did, as women, come together as a reaction to the threat that we perceive from values that we cannot abide or accept,
and values that we want to uphold.
Exactly. Yeah. But I think back to, because I'm a different generation, I was involved in the anti-war movement in the 60s, and a lot of people were referring to these marches as, that's great, but then what? And I think since the 60s, there hasn't been a demonstration of this kind of level of global power to stop something. And in fact, if we had not done that in the 60s, the Vietnam War would have gone on much longer. But it was the result of a peace movement. So it was pro-peace, and it was anti-war, but it was really pro-peace that changed the politics of the time, despite a lot of resistance and a lot of social upheaval around that kind of oppositional approach to a very hot topic. And of course, the Vietnam War involved a lot of people who lost their sons. People wanted to believe that they were dying for something. They did not want to believe that lives were lost for nothing. And so there was that polarization around, the purpose. And I think it's the same kind of thing here. Politics are getting embedded in this, and political perspectives are being taken and applied to this movement. But I think it's very important for us to be clear about what we are for, just as you've said.
Yeah.
And not being focused on what we're trying to eliminate or shut down. So I have a lot of hope from my own experience that this movement can become a very powerful influence. And we as individuals, need to step up and be capable and ready for it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I also believe that we our eyes have been opened, and we need to be vigilant, because this happened on our watch.
Yeah,
all of this happened on our watch, and even the voices, as you were talking about earlier, says, "I don't need feminism; it's already happened. We're already equal." That was a signal. And that's been said for quite some time over the last couple of decades. That's a signal that things are moving into complacency. Oh, we've arrived. We've got everything we need now. And if we rest, and we're not considering that it needs protection, they can be so fragile. So we may need to stand up and stand up against that tide, and also look forward. It's kind of like looking back, but also looking forward. Into what is it that we want to create, and where does this march take us? It was headed in every march was headed in a forward direction, and so to me that's what I want to focus on, is how do we keep moving in a forward direction, in a hopeful forward direction. As you and I are talking about alpha male leadership and conversations around women in power, is what is it power to? What is it that we want? What is it that we're looking to do with power?
We're coming close to the end of our call, but on that subject of what do we do, where do we go from here, I just want to also put out there to people that Alpha Male Leadership is about this conversation. But Carrie and I are also coaches, and we are planning some workshops. So I wanted to bring it back to the notion of where do we go from here? And that has to do with building our resilience, building our capacity to be connected to a sense of empowerment, and embodying that kind of leadership. So those things can be challenged, especially when women, or anyone, but women, start to move out of a particular role that they may have occupied. So for those women who are wanting to step out more, or step out for the first time, or step out in ways that they've never done before, and they know that it's going to be a challenge to their embodiment of leadership, to their equilibrium, to their influence. Alpha Male Leadership is there as part of that in terms of offering resource and support for women wanting to do that. So I think we should start to close our webinar for this month. What would you like to sum it up with, Carrie?
Well, it'd be great to have people join us for next month, which is going to be February. What's our next date? It's look on my calendar here, February 22nd.
Yep.
For our next conversation. And if you have a guest you'd like to have us have on the show, please let us know. You can send an email to info@alphamareleadership.com, and we'd love to look at perhaps even interviewing you.
Yeah.
If you like to be interviewed, drop us a line and tell us what intrigues you about women in power, your relationship as a woman leader, and what intrigues you about alpha male leadership.
Great. Yeah. And meanwhile, we will be sending out an invitation and information. You can find us on Facebook, Alphamare Leadership. We have a website, alphamaireleadership.com. And how are we doing with the LinkedIn page, Carrie?
I don't know yet.
Okay.
Hopefully that will be up.
But you can also reach Carrie and I individually. And I want to thank you for stopping by. And thank you, Carrie, for partnering with me in this venture. And
thank you.
Look forward to next time.
All right.
Thanks.
Bye, everybody.